Hi, I'm Brian Freer, tutoring high school biology. Today's topic, birds, the next step up evolutionarily from reptiles. Alright, well you probably know a thing or two about birds. You know they have feathers, legs with scales, wings, because you've probably seen them. Well, birds are also endothermic. They're endotherms. That means they regulate their body temperature through internal processes. They'll eat, and then heart and blood flow will keep their body temperature more or less constant. Alright, speaking of eating, birds have a very interesting and efficient digestive system. Now, in some ways it's similar to humans. You put food in, it goes down the esophagus. That's just the tube that, well, leads away from your mouth. But the birds have this organ called the crop, where food is actually stored and moistened first before it's moved down to the stomach. This makes it maybe easier to handle. And then even after the stomach, they have the gizzard, which is a lot like the stomach. The stomach, churns up food. The gizzard also churns up food, but it usually has these hard pebbles and stones in it that help churn up the food even more. This would be pretty useful if you were a bird, say, eating worms. You might get some dirt or something that's really hard to crunch up. Gizzard really aids in that. And then, of course, you go through the small and large intestine and ultimately out the exit. But yes, that is the bird digestive system. Now, it's known for its very efficient water absorption. You may have noticed that bird excrement is actually quite dry. That's it right there. Alright, onto the circulatory system. Again, closed, dual loop. But here we have something very interesting. The bird's circulatory system involves a four-chambered heart. Let's take a look. Okay, well the ventricle's finally being separated into the right and left ventricle. You have the right and left atrium, but let me show you how it works. Alright, so oxygen-poor blood will come in from the body to the right atrium, and then it empties into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps oxygen-poor blood up into the lungs, where it becomes oxygen-rich. The blood then comes into the left atrium, which goes into the left ventricle, which pumps the oxygen-rich blood out through the body. To quickly remember this, anything that is right atrium and right ventricle will always contain oxygen-poor blood. Anything that's on the left atrium and left ventricle will contain oxygen-rich blood. And also remember that the ventricles are the things that do the pumping, and the atriums are the things that do the receiving. Aside from that, yes, two loops, lungs and body. Now, I need to say a word about the bird's skeletal structure, because this is very unusual. Birds fly, but that means that the bones can't be too heavy. Bird bones are actually kind of hollow. These are the sides of the bones, and on the inside we actually have these kinds of hollow spots, air pockets, that allow the bird to have a very sturdy bone with these kinds of struts, yet have a very light bone as well. That's bird's skeletal structure. Alright, last up, reproduction. Birds only reproduce at certain times of year. Any other time, and their reproductive organs are actually shrunk. Now, for reproduction itself, they usually require some sort of mating ritual. Dances, songs. This is all learned, usually instinctively. And that's how birds reproduce. Alright, to recap. Birds have feathers, legs with scales, wings. They're endothermic, meaning they regulate their body temperature through internal processes. And they have a very interesting digestive system. Food travels down the esophagus to the crop, where it's stored and moistened. Then it goes down to the stomach, where it's crunched up. Then further on to the gizzard, where it's further more crunched up, but the gizzard has small stones to aid in that. Then through the small intestine, large intestine, and out. Birds have very efficient water absorption. This can be evidenced from their excrement, which is usually quite dry. Looking at birds' circulatory system, the birds have a four-chambered heart. The left atrium and left ventricle will hold oxygen-rich blood. The left atrium receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs. The left ventricle pumps oxygen-rich blood out to the body. Then the right atrium and right ventricle will contain oxygen-poor blood. The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the body, and the right ventricle pumps oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. For bird skeletal structure, the bird's bone is mostly hollow with connections between one end of the bone and the other to create a sturdy yet also light structure. For reproduction, organs are usually shrunk when not in mating season. Birds will usually also have to undergo a mating ritual to mate, song or dance. Alright, that's all for now. Again, I'm Brian Freer. See you next time.